Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Crow Canyon webinar series. My name is Mark Varian. I've been an archaeologist here at Crow Canyon since 1987, and it's a real pleasure for me to moderate our webinar tonight with Dr. Jim Allison on Recent Archaeological Research by Brigham Young University in Southeast Utah. I have a few introductory slides, and the first one is to thank people that make this possible. And this really big thanks go to Dylan Schwint and Taylor Hasbrook from Crow Canyon, who make these possible behind the scenes, both the technology of the webinar and working with the scholars to get the webinar organized. We've also been lucky to receive funding, which has been provided by the Colorado Humanities and National Endowment for Humanities as a part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security CARES Act. So we're very grateful for Dylan and Taylor's work and for that funding support. Okay, if you're joining us with Zoom, there's a few things you might want to know if you've never done it before. First is, if the talking heads, like maybe me right now, is in the way, you can minimize that box and drag it to the upper corner so it doesn't overlap with the presentation. Second, we want to get your questions, and the best way to do that is with the Q&A button that I believe will be at the bottom of your screen. You'll see that button, and you just click on that, and you can ask questions. I'll be tracking those questions, and I may interrupt Jim and ask him one, or may save those questions for the end. If you're having any difficulties with the Zoom, you can also stream this live at facebook.com Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. So there will be some people joining us there, and people will be asking questions through their Facebook feed too. If you have a bad connection or you have to leave early, we're posting all of these webinars on Crow Canyon's YouTube site, which you can get to at that link that you see on this slide. Or if you forget that, you can just Google Crow Canyon YouTube. It'll come up. And then you click on the video button at the top. And there's a whole series. There's probably 20 or 30 of them now that are up there. So be sure and check that out. We are the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. We were founded in 1983, and our mission is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. We typically bring students of all ages, beginning with fourth graders, and we've had folks in their 90s in our programs. We bring them to our campus, which you can see in this picture. Unfortunately, we can't do that right now. And this webinar series has been one of the ways we've tried to continue meeting this mission. And it's been really successful. The webinars have been really well attended, and the presentations have been spectacular. So we're pleased that we can still deliver our mission in this way. There's 2 more webinars coming up in the next on the schedule. Next Thursday is Rob Weiner. I haven't met him, but we exchanged a bunch of emails. He's actually been in the Four Corners doing his research. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado, and he's going to be presenting on Chaco's monumental roads, new field work and insights. I think he's really trying to create a new integrated look at roads. Then the following Thursday will be Genevieve Woodhead, who is presenting on what can we learn from coiling and corrugation in Southwest ceramics. And while I don't know her, I do know her work, and I know that we can learn a lot. And I'm going to learn a lot by tuning into that webinar. We've had a lot of requests here at Crow Canyon because people have recognized that the Indian nations of the Four Corners country have really been hit hard by the coronavirus. So this slide shows a number of places that you can donate to help with the efforts to mitigate the problems of the coronavirus in the Indian nations of the Four Corners. So you can be writing one of these down now. If you don't have anything to write with and you want to come back to it, just go to the YouTube page. This talk will be posted probably within about 24 hours, and you can pull up this slide and get this information that way. Okay, let me first ask Taylor, did I forget anything in my introduction, or did I cover everything I need to?
You covered everything. It was perfect.
Okay, thank you, Taylor. So I'll move on to introduce my friend and really valued colleague, Jim Allison. Jim began his career in 1984 at the Brigham Young University Field School at Nancy Patterson Village. And I'm not sure he remembers it, but I wandered out and met him when he was working there that year. Jim went on to receive his master's degree from BYU and then to Arizona State University to get his PhD, where he and I were both there at the same time working on our PhD. He returned to BYU and is now a professor there and also chair of the Department of Anthropology. He's going to be talking tonight about his fieldwork in southeastern Utah, but he's also directed major research projects in the Fremont and Virgin regions on the northern and western frontiers of the greater Southwest, with his focus being the understanding the social and economic organization of ancient farmers and the historical forces that shaped their societies. Definitely one of the most respected people in our field. Jim, it's really a pleasure to have you here, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Okay. If I can figure out my screen sharing at the moment, that is not the screen I want. Okay, if I got the screen sharing right, you should be seeing my title slide. So first thing I want to say is the title here, Recent Archaeological Research, is one we thought of a long time ago. Originally, I was scheduled to give a talk at the edge of the Cedars Museum in Blanding, and this is the title we came up with for that. And we just sort of, when the coronavirus basically meant we couldn't do in-person talks, we sort of moved it over here. I kept the title. At the time, it was just sort of a placeholder, and I wasn't sure quite what I was going to talk about. So one thing I'll say is that, especially that word recent, I'm going to do some violence to the word recent here. And we're going to talk about things, recent archaeological research in the sense of things I've been thinking about lately, but some of the field work is not all that recent. Mark did a decent job of introducing me. I thought I'd throw this slide up just to sort of give a sense of who I am as an archaeologist and where I've worked. You can see basically the triangles mark like the top 20 places I've worked, I've written about, I've done. In some cases, it's big ceramic analysis projects. Other cases, it's multi-year excavations. But you can see there's several clusters, one in southeastern Utah, where we're going to be talking about today, where I've done a bunch of projects. Out west near St. George and down into Arizona, there's the Virgin Anasazi region, where I've done a bunch of work, and my doctoral dissertation research was over there. And then up into central and northern Utah, working with Fremont sites. And so those of you who were present or attending for last week's seminar may have noticed that Katie Richards, the presenter, mentioned my name a few times in conjunction with Fremont research. I'll make sure to mention her, Katie Richards. She's actually a former MA student of mine, and we've worked together a lot. But I have done a bunch of work in the Fremont area. We're not going to talk about that today. Today, we're going to focus on these three projects. The Little Bali Mesa is a survey project working with a lot of small sites. Alkali Ridge Site 13 is a large Pueblo 1 village, one of the first ancestral Pueblo villages. There are smaller sites before that, but a real village where people come together. dating to the 700s, and then coal bed village. And I'll tell more about these as we go. The work at coal bed is really the only thing that's recent in the sense of having been done in the last few years. But again, I've been thinking about these other projects a lot lately and writing about them and stuff. So first thing I want to do is talk about Little Bali Mesa. In my virtual background here, I'm really in my office. I'm not, unfortunately, out looking over the landscape that's behind me. But you can see it's essentially, I think it is the same slide that I'm showing here in the virtual background. But Little Bali Mesa is this flat, small mesa top within the Bears Ears National Monument. It's a kind of an interesting place geographically and archaeologically. I think of it as kind of an island surrounded by 1,000-foot drops on three sides and a 1,000-foot rise up to Milk Ranch Point is where the picture's taken from on the other side. And so it's very isolated by these really steep elevation changes. Difficult to get on and off the mesa. The drive from where the picture's taken down onto the mesa is between 1 and 2 miles. It takes usually about 45 minutes to do that drive because the road is so rough. But in any case, let's talk about the archaeology. I first did archaeology out on Little Bali Mesa survey, just recording sites, no excavation, in 1998. The photo here is a little later, but in 1998, this is essentially what the landscape looked like. If you look at, we're looking at a Google Earth view here, but notice all the weird lines and patterns on the ground. What happened here is in the 1960s, the area was chained. Basically, people driving bulldozers with big chains between them, knocking all the trees down. The idea being that doing that increases the growth of grass and makes it better forage for wildlife, or probably cattle is the main reason why they did it. But they did it, something went very badly wrong with the way they chained the mesa top back in the 1960s. And by the 1980s, it had sort of this pattern that you see in the photo. There are long rows or just lines where nothing grew because they scraped the topsoil as they drug the bulldozers through. And in between, the dead trees wound up piled in these long linear rows. And by the 1990s, you had regrowth only within those rows of dead trees. And in between, it was basically just bare ground. And the Bureau of Land Management decided they wanted to go in and start over and try and do a better job with it and do a vegetation treatment. And so they put out a request for proposals to do a sample survey of this 2,000-acre area. Now, the idea of doing a sample survey in 2,000 acres is a little weird because the sampling units have to be kind of small and stuff. But basically, in 1998, we went out and surveyed the areas shown in blue. The boxes are the actual sampling areas. What I did is I divided it up, that odd-shaped area as best I could, into squares where I could, and odd-shaped, just various shapes where it didn't work, and randomly selected the areas we were going to survey. This is what it looked like. Survey, in this case, was basically you're in a clearing, you bust through these piles of dead logs and thick growth of trees into the next clearing, and you look for sites while you do it. It was not a lot of fun in terms of survey. Also, we didn't have, finding the edges of the sample survey units was difficult. GPS technology was not very advanced. So this is me in 1998 with a backpack GPS unit, the thing sticking up above my head as an antenna. And in those days, it was still, the military still controlled GPS technology. They scrambled the signal, so you couldn't even tell where you were on the ground. You had to basically record data, go back, load it onto a computer, and process it to figure out, to sort of take out the noise that the military was intentionally putting into the GPS signal. and figure out where you had been. Nowadays, it's a lot easier. You take a handheld unit out, it tells you where you are. Works much better. In any case, we did this sample survey. I think the BLM was hoping we could do a small sample, show there weren't very many archaeological sites out there, and they just do their vegetation treatment. It didn't work out that way. So they waited about 10 years after the survey I did, and I can't remember if it was 2007 or 8 or 9, somewhere in there, they got another contract archaeology company out there to survey the rest of the area. And then they went out and did their vegetation treatment. And so now you can see that same area. Now there's a little bit of green, there is some grass that grows, and you don't have those weird growths. So they did it. It is in somewhat better shape now. There's still some things are kind of a mess. But here are the archaeological sites. And these aren't all of them. These are just habitation sites. There are about 150 sites total within this area of about 2,000 acres. It's not that big. 58 of those are habitation sites. They look like somebody actually lived there. The other ones are, small scatters of artifacts. We can't tell that somebody lived there. But these are like houses, houses and hamlets and things. And one of the things I did in 1998 is I went out and as we were recording these sites, I went and counted ceramics on every site. And after the other company went out there and recorded these additional sites, they didn't collect the same data. So in 2017, I went back out there with some help from graduate students, and we revisited all of the big sites, the habitation sites that they recorded, and counted more ceramics on them. So here, just to show you, this is kind of what sites look like out there. They're not very spectacular. This is about as good as it gets. It's a nice little rubble mound. It's a house, basically. But one of the things about Little Bali Mesa is it's so hard to get to and isolated that there still are lots and lots of artifacts on the ground. So you can see, if you look at this photo, there's a couple thousand potsherds in this photo probably. And what I did on these sites, just so you have a sense, didn't collect anything, but we did dog leash surveys. Basically just put a point down, usually a chaining pin with a string tied onto it, and collect any potsherd that was within 2 meters of that pin. We'd map the location of the pin, throw them onto in this case, this is a poncho that was really a nice poncho until I did this all summer long with it. And then, sort them into piles, count them, and then put them back in that same area. And so I have data on about 18,000 potsherds, which allows me to date the sites really pretty well, all these habitation sites. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a series of maps that basically look at settlement changes on Little Bali Mesa. None of this the scale is really small. And maybe let's run through it, and then I'll talk about why I think it's so interesting. So these are Basketmaker 3 sites. They date between 500 and 750 AD. And what I've done here, so the lines are, I don't really know that I really want to get into explaining it, but there's sort of it's a network analysis where we're connecting sites based on their spatial locations, doing a triangulation, and basically the algorithm that does this tries to draw triangles wherever it can without letting any lines cross. And then any connections that it would make that were over 2 kilometers long, I've dropped out here. And it just is a good way to visualize what's going on with the settlement pattern. The size of the dots here are scaled to my estimate of the number of houses on a site. So most of these are one house. There's a site, if I can point with my cursor, that one looks like it's probably 2 houses, and I think this is 3. And that's it. There's nothing here that you call a village. It's a very dispersed settlement pattern spread out all over the mesa. And the interesting thing here as we go, watch how it changes from period to period. So these sites all date between 500 and 750 AD based on ceramics. We're going to jump to the early Pueblo I period. This is when we get to talk about Alkali Ridge Site 13. These sites date to the same time period, but are much, much smaller. But notice how we have that connected network in Basamaker 3. Now we just sort of have two little clusters of sites. A couple of sites here look like they have 2 or 3 houses on them, but again, mostly it's just single houses. From about 825, like throughout most of the 800s, there's nobody out here. Now this is kind of interesting. If we jump over to some other areas like in Colorado, this is when we have big villages near the town of Dolores. Big villages dating in mostly in this time period, especially the latter part of this 825 to 875 time period. There's nobody here on Little Bali Mesa. There's one house that falls in that time period we've located. But then watch what happens in the next period as we move into sort of a late Pueblo 2, early Pueblo, or late Pueblo 1, early Pueblo 2, according to our jargon, basically late 800s into the early 900s. Suddenly, we have only in the north part of the mesa 3 really big sites. These 2 over here are close enough that they're probably really one settlement, although from an archaeological perspective, we recorded this southernmost of those 2. I can't point very well with my cursor. This one we recorded in 1998, but didn't even see this one. It's 100 meters away, basically. The dots overlap because they're bigger than the sites actually are. But basically about 15 households between those 2 sites, and then over here about another 12 households, and then a couple of little just one house things going on. So a very different settlement pattern, more aggregation than we see at any other time on the mesa top. And then sometime around the middle 900s, everybody goes away again, right? There's one house again that we were able to fit into that time period between about the middle 900s and the middle 1000s. Then in the late 1000s, people come back again, and you have this network that connects over across the whole top of the mesa. This is, again, probably into the early to middle 1100s. You have this spread out settlement pattern. All of these are single houses, right? One house living at some distance from their neighbors. This is what really intrigues me, is this jump here. As we go 1150 to 1200, nobody's living on the southern part of the mesa. The northern part of the mesa gets really densely populated. And then as we move into the 1200s, again, based on ceramic dating, that pattern fades out again, and then it's gone. Now, people aren't totally gone from the region here probably until the 1260s at least, or 1270s. There's a site that's just off the northern corner of my map, not on the mesa top, so not part of the survey, but a site called Lewis Lodge, which is a Pueblo 3 cliff dwelling. It's basically a village built in the side of the cliff in this canyon, just a little bit off the map here. So they basically move, again, from went too far, hang on. From this, they move up here, and then pretty much everybody drifts down and joins together a generation or 2 later in that large site that's down in the canyon, and not too much on the mesa top.
Hey, Jim,
Yeah.
This is Mark. Can you go back to a slide?
Yeah.
I got a question asking what is the scale? So that square, about how many miles or kilometers is it on a side?
I've got versions of this with the scale. I kind of purposely took some of the location information off.
Right. What's the distance between those sites?
Less than 2 kilometers, because it wouldn't show the links if they were 2 kilometers. They might be 1 kilometer apart, roughly, as they're spaced out. The whole area is 2,000 acres, between 3 and 4 square miles for the whole survey area.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So when we add those all up, now notice the width of the bars differ here because my time periods differ. This is just trying to figure out how many households were out there. Really, it's more interesting, I think, to look at this. This is dividing now by the length of time. assuming that each house lasts 25 years. So we get momentary households. So at any one time in those time periods, that's what the population looks like. But also, there's some question about whether the later sites, which are more substantially built, they have better masonry, and as Mark Varian showed back in his doctoral dissertation, I think that there's good evidence that those later sites last longer. So here I've actually used 50 years as the time period for those later sites. And you can kind of see that's what I think the pattern of sort of settlement out there looks like. So within that area, that whole Mesa top probably never had more than about, probably never had 100 people living on it at any one time, maybe close to 100 at those peak times. But it's a really interesting pattern, first off, of people moving on and off the Mesa. The gap here in the middle to late 800s is really interesting because that's a time period when we know that there are aggregated Pueblo I villages in other areas. And when those villages break up, this big bar corresponds with the time period when it's pretty hard to find sites in southwest Colorado. But you move over into Utah, and there's a lot more, and including on Little Bali Mesa. This gap, I think, corresponds to a region-wide, like the whole northern San Juan is probably a pretty low population at that time period, and then people come back. And as they come back onto Little Bali Mesa as well. So some of that corresponds to broader patterns in interesting ways, and some of that might be driven by environment. You know, if it's cold and wet, you move to a lower elevation. If it's hot and dry, you move to a higher elevation, and it's just easier to farm. So with those sort of generational scale environmental shifts, people are moving around because of that. And so some of that is explicable here, but other parts of this, the changes in the shape of the settlement pattern. I mean, it's a flat mesa. It's all at the same elevation. There's just not really any obvious advantage to being in one part of it rather than another. And yet you get those really radically different looks to the way people arrange themselves on the landscape. So I'm not going to answer the question as to why, because I don't know the answer. I suspect for part of it, the presence of a Chocowin great house called Arch Canyon ruin off the kind of the southeast corner of the mesa may affect the settlement pattern during certain time periods. And also the presence of Lewis Lodge as it forms, it may be forming in that Pueblo III time period when people are sort of sucked up to the north part of the mesa. They may actually be sort of attached to what's turning into a larger settlement in Lewis Lodge. But in any case, just super interesting patterns of shifts at a very small scale, which to me is really interesting. I think in Southwest archaeology, we've been paying attention for a long time to, especially the last few decades, to large-scale shifts in settlement, but the changes at this small scale are really intriguing to me. Okay, I'm starting to get worried about time already. So let's jump on now to some excavations. Alkali Ridge Site 13 is a large early Pueblo I village. It dates in the late 700s. We have tree-ring dates that show it was first established in the late 750s, and the latest tree-ring date we have is right around, I think it's 778. There may be a little bit of activity at the site after that, but probably abandoned sometime in the 780s. So it's this village that forms and is probably abandoned all within about one generation, probably home to about 200 people, so maybe twice as many people in this one village as ever lived on Little Bali Mesa at the same time. It was excavated in the 1930s by Harvard University. A guy named Joe Brew is a famous southwestern archaeologist in the sort of the middle 20th century. excavated out there in the 1930s. We went back in 2012 and 2013 and did some excavations at a much smaller scale in these two parts of the site. And so what I'm going to talk about is sort of putting together information from those 1930s excavations with what we found when we went back and did smaller but more intensive excavation on these other parts of the site. This is just a shot of those tree ring dates. I don't know that I want to spend much time on it, but you can kind of see how they spread out. Non-cutting dates, of course, go on earlier. Some of them are older than the site, really. But here are the first cutting dates in the 750s. This is what it looked like in the 1930s. You can see these long rows of rooms running off through the trees. Basically, those rows of rooms are surface houses, contiguous rows of houses. The rows of rooms are too deep, generally. You have these domestic or habitation rooms in front, which are larger. They have hearths in them and other features for cooking and storing food and doing just daily life. And then kind of smaller, featureless back rooms, which are storage rooms. And each of those domestic rooms is usually attached to about two, occasionally 3 of the storage rooms. So those are houses, showing there with the blue rectangles there. This is what one of those houses look like. In fact, this is one of the few that actually has 3 storage rooms. So you have this big habitation room here running off the edge of the slide, a storage room and another storage room and another storage room, all sort of attached to each other in this double row of rooms. And then all the houses are attached, house after house, sort of apartment style, like a single-story apartment. Here's what we excavated, at least part of what we excavated in 2012 and 2013. We re-excavated some storage rooms that had been excavated in the 30s, these rooms. One of the things we learned from that is dirt gets really hard in 80 years, more so than I thought. I thought we'd just have some sand to clean out to re-excavate them, but it was work to clean them out. This room we excavated for the first time, and then we got into pieces of these habitation rooms down here. We didn't fully excavate them. But you can see that is essentially a house. We never did find this wall. We think it's about there. There's some evidence for it. But there's some erosion that had affected it. Another house over here that we excavated part of, and then this storage room must go with the house over there. Okay. One of the interesting things about Site 13 is the pottery. So there's a ceramic type called a Bajo red on orange, red paint on an orange background. Some of these vessels are discolored from being in structure fires. But they have these really interesting designs. The design style is extremely variable. It's completely unlike any of the stuff that went before, but actually very like Mugion red on brown ceramics. Some of the designs on Holocom pottery, those are from the southern Southwest, a couple hundred miles to the south. And it suggests that when this village formed in the 750s, it probably included immigrants from those areas. There's a couple of technological things too that are shared. There's see how the paint is smeared here? This is Mugion brownware, or red on, officially red on brown, but you can see it's redder than this is a Bajo red on orange. So don't make too much of the color names. The technology is very similar, but they're smearing the paint because they're painting and then doing some polishing before the paint's completely dry. Presumably they wanted to wait a little longer so they didn't smear it, but it happens because of the order they're doing things. And the same thing's happening here on this Bajo red on orange vessel. Okay, so let's jump on. So one of the things I want to talk about, there's a couple of things. One is the architectural variation of the site, which is super interesting. I've already suggested that there's immigrants from the southern Southwest moving into the site, but I think there also are people moving in and joining this village from closer on. And you see that in a couple of ways. One is pit structures. I think we can distinguish first off two main types of pit structures. The first ones are small, they're basically houses of a sort. We have all these surface houses as well. Some of those are circular, some are square, and you can see I've used circles and squares to show that. And then there's larger, oversized pit structures, which are too large to be houses. They must have been used communally and built communally for sure. And they vary beyond that in sort of the ways that they're roofed and the details of their construction. So here you have these small, roughly sub-rectangular ones. They all have a pretty standard roofing pattern, 4 post holes. They have wing walls, which is near the southern ends here, being shown in sort of slightly different ways in these drawings, which are traced from the report of the 1930s excavation. So generally there's a post hole, 2 post holes in the wing walls on either side, and then 2 north of the hearth somewhere up here, and 4 post holes. These rounder ones also have posts in their wing walls, which come in a little differently. But then each of these has 2 extra roof supports. They've got 6 roof supports, but they still look like houses. So they're just different, built differently, different styles. And then we have these oversized pit structures, which also have 6 posts. And then they also have a line of posts around the inside that shows that there was a wall basically lining the interior. On a normal pit house, you dig a hole, you kind of smooth it. You might plaster something to smooth the edge of the hole you dug, but basically you don't add anything much. It's just sort of the edge of the hole is the edge of your building. Here they actually built fairly substantial walls lining the insides of these larger pit structures, which seem to have had some sort of communal and possibly ritual functions. So this is one of those big ones, and you can see with the white arrows, we're pointing at the post holes here. Also, if you notice a little bit of out of focus stuff here, this is a big block of dirt that the photographer's standing on. It's out of focus because it's much closer to the camera than the floor of the structure. So they excavated about 85% of the structure, but left this dirt in the corner. And we went in and dug a trench through that dirt. And here's where we hit the wall. And you can see post holes. We haven't excavated them all here, but you can pretty clearly see the post hole there. This one's dug out. There's a post hole here and another post hole here. So those closely spaced posts. In between, you have this adobe pressed in. And we found these because the structure burned. All that adobe in the wall is fire hardened, and it's really kind of interesting to look at. So this is the biggest chunk we collected. It's clearly part of that wall that lines the interior of that big pit structure that we were just looking at. There's post impression on either side, which you can't see well in the photo, and then fingerprints all through here where somebody has pressed the mud, basically sort of adobe clay, up against the posts as they're laying the wall in, kind of smoothed it over here. Jumping around a little bit, this is more adobe out of storage rooms, but we actually had some fun looking at all the different impressions. Sometimes there are these flat impressions. They look like boards. Obviously, they're not milled lumber, but they're split boards, probably relatively flat, in the roof of, in this case, a storage room. More finger impressions, so you can actually sort of see the evidence of the people who made these. This chunk seems to have been up against what was probably a bundle of small sticks. And in some cases, I'm not sure if those are ties, but there are cases where you can actually see it looks like they're bundles of sticks that are tied together with some kind of string. Here we get corncob impressions. And sometimes when they're up against wood beams, you can get a sense of the diameter of the wood beam, the beam it was up against. So we know, for instance, that the storage room beams tended to be sort of 7, usually no more than 10 centimeters in diameter. The big pit house, it's more like 15 centimeters bigger wood. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression, but the corncob impressions in particular, I think, are kind of interesting here. Okay, so we talked pit structure variation. Wall variation within the storage rooms is interesting to me. This is one of the 1930s, actually all these would be 1930s excavations, but this is one of the rooms excavated in the 1930s that we then came back and re-excavated. And when they found it, notice that the base of the wall is completely covered with adobe. You couldn't really see what was going on, but basically this wall is constructed with a row of slabs at the base, all this mud in front of and over the top of it, and then balancing on the slab and the sort of adobe mud fronting it, you have these alternating rows of rocks and adobe. Shouldn't really call them bricks because I don't think they're actually made. They're actually sort of lumps of adobe that are put on the wall wet, and then another row of rocks. In one case, from one of those walls, we found the wall had collapsed, and you can sort of see it's not masonry. It's not sort of tightly packed rocks with just a little mortar in between, but it's rows of rocks, just as much adobe, and then similar size to the row of rocks, and then another row of rocks, another thick row of adobe. Sort of interesting wall construction. This type of wall, Joe Brew, who did those 30s excavations, called a Type 1 wall. But he recognized 4 other wall types. Type 2 walls actually sort of have 2 rows of slabs, and then similar wall construction above. The Type 3 wall does away with the slabs completely. Type 4 walls are basically closely spaced posts. So you can see all these little post holes, and then adobe there. And then a Type 5 wall, according to Brew, was a wall that was adobe without those posts in between. So you have these 5 different styles of wall, all of which are plastered over. So once you finish the wall, you can't tell what the style is. They just all look like the same thing. But their distribution within the site is really interesting. So two of those are common, right? The slabs at the base, the Type 1 walls, and Type 3, which don't have slabs, but have that sort of alternating rock and adobe construction. And when you map out how those are distributed through the site, it's really interesting. This northern arc of rooms is almost all Type 1 walls. The walls down here are almost all this Type 3, but then notice the gaps. There are rooms in there, they just are other types of walls. So that, first off, suggests, at least, well, let me go through a couple of inferential steps here. I would make the assumption that the different styles of walls simply mean that the builders had different ideas about how to construct storage rooms, and that those ideas about how storage rooms should be built reflect local traditions, and therefore, at some level, different sort of social identities. And you can see then that it appears that the northern part of the site is built by one group of people related to each other in some way, at least sharing ideas about how the walls should be built. And the southern part, mostly built by people with a very different idea. But then when you look at the rare wall types, start to be able to see that they're sort of interspersed, mostly in the southern 2/3 of the site. But basically, you get 2 storage rooms here. It's the storage rooms of the house built with one type. There's another house here. These look like houses built with these are different types of walls. And they're all sort of just individual houses, just sort of plopped in the middle of rows of houses built with different styles. I think I forgot to mention that in the 1930s, they did not excavate very many of the surface habitation rooms, the ones with hearths. So basically, they were excavating just the storeroom parts of the houses. So we don't know what the habitation rooms look like through a lot of this. They excavated about 20 of the habitation rooms, but there's dozens and dozens more that they left unexcavated. Another interesting thing about Site 13 is it seems as though essentially the whole site burned down. So if you read my map key here, the darker gray are burned. The lighter gray ones, we can't tell from the notes if they're burned or not. These are big, like here we're looking at where the habitation rooms were, but were not excavated, so we just don't know there. And then there's a very few rooms where they definitely aren't burned. So it looks to me, this isn't the only reason, but there's a couple of reasons. But but the pattern of rooms makes it look like it's a fire that started deliberately in several different locations, and the whole site burns down. And when it burned down with lots of stuff in it, which we'll get to in a second. Just a quick look at what we actually excavated. These are the rooms they excavated in the 30s, showing what we had to work with. Here's where we came back to it. So the numbers here are the numbers that Joe Brew gave these rooms. But 74, 75, 76, we re-excavated. He didn't dig out here, but notice they just threw the dirt out. And you see the dirt humped here. I won't read this figure for you, but except for basically above that line there, the black dirt here is their back dirt, and it's all over on both sides, more than that. So if you look down at what we excavated, I've sort of shown a couple of things. The point of this, aside from being a nice shot of what we excavated, see a hearth right there with a metate and a mono in the trough, right next to it, another metate here. So this is one habitation room that we excavated the most of. But in this one next door, there was a huge pile of maize. And in the back dirt from the 1930s excavations, there were just massive amounts of maize, most of which seems to have been in this storage room. So the point of that, at least one point of it, is that when people left the site because of the burning, they left because, or they left a lot of food. They also left a lot of ceramic vessels, all kinds of stuff left in the rooms. It does not look to me like they left because they wanted to, because they would have taken the food at least with them. Some of the heavier stuff that you didn't want to carry, maybe not. This is kind of what that looks like. This is some of the stuff out of the back dirt, just piles and piles of kernels, a few cob fragments. And then in that habitation room, there's this pile of kernels still on the cob right up against the north wall of that room. You can kind of see there's a cob right there. There's one here, one here. This was really hard to excavate because it was so fragile. I tried to excavate the cobs with the kernels still on them, but it turned out not to be possible to keep the kernels on the cobs. So to sum up, the reason Site 13 I think is so interesting is, first off, it's one of the earliest villages in the area. Suddenly you go from settlement patterns where people are dispersed to about 200 people living together. There's good evidence that there's immigration from the south, but multiple social groups coming together into the site. And then it ends in what seems to be sort of I would interpret this as potentially somebody burning out the people who lived here. It's not like there's a massacre. There's no evidence of a big battle. There's one body that Brew found in a pit house that hadn't been properly buried. But it does look as though the site was burned, and it's not the sort of ritual burning that we typically see at pit structures, but all these storage rooms burned with food in them and all sorts of items from daily life and stuff that were just left behind and lost in the fire. Okay, let me jump to my third example.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah.
Before we move on, let me ask a couple questions that have been posed about Alkali Ridge.
Okay.
One is, in the Alkali Ridge Pueblos, were the storage rooms connected to the living rooms by interior passageways, or were they all entered through the roof with ladders?
In most cases, there's not very good evidence. There were a couple places where Brew found pieces of doorways intact. So they're small, and by doorways, I mean they're sort of hatches or something. They're not something you could walk through standing up, but they're little sort of window-sized openings between the habitation rooms and the storage rooms. And then in the storage rooms, in a lot of cases, there's actually a little extra slab up against the base of the wall. I don't know if we can see it. No, we can't really see it. But like right here, there was one, and right here, and it looks like there's sort of steps down that are sort of where those hatches would have been. But in these rooms, the evidence of the doorways is gone. It's just too high on the wall, and the walls aren't preserved there. But yes, they were connected to the habitation rooms So there would have been a way from this room to get into that and into that.
Okay, we should keep moving, but I'm going to ask a couple more and get quick answers too. One person says, with a difference in building styles, do you believe they were built by the same group of people or different groups? You sort of answered that, but then this person asked, were they all basically Anasazi?
Well, that's a really good question. They were. So I would argue that there are actually, you can see deliberate strategies here to with communal ritual, with the sort of masking of the architectural differences, because these are architectural differences we can see when we take the walls apart, but you couldn't see them when they were in use, right? So people are not like building this style and saying, hey, here's my style of house, and here's we're different. They're making everything look the same. So they're forming. I think what you're actually seeing is the construction of an Anasazi identity here, of an ancestral Pueblo identity, involving people who probably a lot of them had some sort of relationship, but also enough difference that we can see it in the architecture. But they're sort of coming together and forging a common identity.
Along these same lines, the layout suggests sequential construction. Is it possible differences in wall construction had to do with the availability of materials at different times, timbers, etc.?
I would say that's unlikely because, first off, there's not that much time. The materials are, there's still sandstone around. You can still find slabs if you wanted to build a slab-lined room, but people decided sometimes to do it and sometimes not. Wood, you might have had to, through time, go farther away to get the wood, but again, I think it's a really short time period. It's a couple decades that people are living here.
And was the Abajo pottery found throughout the site or only in one area?
All through the site, and it's really the common pottery across southeastern Utah, at least at this time period. And of course, it gets traded out into Colorado, but it's not the most common decorated pottery as you get into Colorado.
Did you get C14 dates on the corn?
I've got a bunch of tree ring dates, and I've got 3 C14 dates on corn. Yeah.
Okay, we should probably move on.
Yeah, I'm worried. I
have some more questions, and we'll ask them at the end.
I should be finishing, but I got one more site to talk to and
I know,
talk
I'm
about.
Worried about
it's
that.
A cool site, so I'll speed up and try and zip through it. So we're going to talk about Coalbed Village. It's one of several sites. These are all sites that BYU has worked on over the years, back to the 1969, when the excavation started at Monument Village. But Coalbed Village are excavations we did in 2018 and 2019 with the BYU Archaeological Field School, and Weber State joined us for that as well. We got into Coalbed. I'll just say it's in Montezuma Canyon. Erosion is a huge problem. So notice the very tall student who looks very small here in this arroyo cut. And the erosion is affecting the site. So I won't say too much about that, but it was important that we started excavating there because of the state lands people who control the site asked us to, because of the problems of erosion. Coalbed is a really interesting site for a couple of reasons. It was visited in 1875 by William Henry Jackson, who took this photo. So aside from the early date of that, notice this rather unusual wall here, which we'll talk about more in the future. It's also one of the first sites ever from the Southwest ever to be described in European archaeological publications. So notice this came out of a 1876 publication in French, which describes work by the Hayden expedition, including Jackson in southeast Utah, in French. Here's a map of the site that we did. Mapping the site was a huge chore. We used a combination of aerial photogrammetry and ground truthing. So Marion Forest went through and ground truth photogrammetry that was done mostly by Scott Muir. They both work here at BYU with me. This, if we can get it to work, is kind of cool. This is a 3D model done from the photogrammetry. I may cut this short if it actually works, but you actually can sort of fly through the 3D model. Notice the site is up here on top of this little meseta, all along this base and slope on the side to the right here. But notice as we come over the top, the big building that will come into the top of the screen up here, right in here. And that unusual wall does not show up well in this photo with the standing stones, but it's actually right here, near but not part of that big building that takes in this whole area right here. Okay, let's go on. So all the architecture on the map dates to probably right around 1200 AD. But we did a lot of surface collection on the site. You can see where there's pottery, late pottery, going with all that architecture scattered across the site, but also concentrations of early ceramic types here and down here and in a few other areas. So clearly there's earlier stuff there that wasn't visible on the surface. Let me run through that, our excavations of that as well. Here you can see this kind of eroded front that we were working on, including this eroded area of dark dirt, these cuts coming through it from erosion. And this is what we found there. So we didn't excavate the whole thing. There's a block of unexcavated fill here. But this is a basket maker 3 pit house that dates to about 600 AD. The hearth is right here, partly cut away by the erosion. Erosion's cutting the floor here. But you can see these this is the floor and the subfloor pits. This thing is about close to 40 square meters as far as we can tell. We found little remnants of the floor across these cuts. So it's a pretty big pit house, but mostly, or at least a good part of it, lost to erosion. We did get some good data out of that area we excavated. We also found early material in 2 places. This is that big building I was pointing out. So there's the wall with the standing stones. 2 places we dug here. So over here on the right in this photo, this is half of a pit house that dates to the 900s AD. This is a trail that comes through, and the pit house, actually, this is the wall. The pit house must extend over under that trail. So every time people walk on the site, they walk over the top of this pit house. Also, trash deposits. So there's 2 layers of midden here. For those of you who are fans of stratigraphy, the darker midden here dates to the 900s. Up here, this lighter colored dirt is still trash midden, lots of potsherds and other stuff in it, dating to the 1200s. And if you follow these over, this is the wall of that big building. Notice the earlier midden goes right under it, and the later one butts up against it. So basically that building is built on earlier deposits. The thing I really want to talk about, though, is the architecture, and especially the way people are using architecture, I would say, to impress at this site, both in this southeastern corner of the site where this big building is, and over here where this building is. So this big building, I would call it Great House. Usually we talk about Chacoan Great Houses. This one's obviously post-Chacoan. Chaco stuff is over with in the early 1100s, and this dates to the 1200s. That wall with the standing stones is near it, and there's a kind of this corridor in between. There's other architecture here. There's a circular feature called the shrine, or everybody calls it the shrine, here, and this high rubble mound. You get a view of it. This is up on top now, and you can see this big building. To get onto the site, the logical way up the site, there's a nice little path that leads you right up into this area, which is the thing people call the shrine, right here. And then you come out of the shrine, and in front of you is that wall with the standing stones. And this was probably high, very high building, 2 stories tall along here. That's what the shrine looks like. Here's the wall. This is basically a 3D LiDAR scan that we did of the wall. You can kind of see it with the rubble behind it. This is my attempt to reconstruct what it looked like. The wall clearly had these stones standing up, tall, big megalithic stones. It would have taken several people at least to move. In between, there was a low masonry wall that, judging by what's still standing, there's a little bit of it left here, and by what's fallen down, was probably never more than about waist high. And then in between the wall and the building is a corridor. So we actually trenched across it. This is one of those megalithic stones. We decided to put our trench across the one that had already fallen down because we didn't want to knock one over or have it fall on a student or something. And so we've trenched across. So this is that corridor space. The wall of the great house building is right here. But notice these flat slabs. So that corridor in between is lined with like flagstones. This flagstone paving. Then here's a remnant of the masonry in between the standing stones. This one, of course, still standing, and this one down flat. And just to look at it from a different angle, same trench. You can see that piece of masonry still there. And then this is the wall of the great house intact. And then we went down quite a ways down in front of that wall and discovered that the great house itself is based on this giant foundation stone, which is set into trash deposit that dates to the 900s, just like on the other side, where I showed you the trash deposit hitting the other side of this building is a good 40 meters away or something, pretty far away, but we were into trash deposits here and possibly structure fill. It looked like structural fill, but it was a very small hole, so I'm not positive that's what we were looking at. And then a quick look at this corner of the site. So that's one way into the site. The other way on this side, I think, is really interesting too. You have this other building, which I also would call a great house. This portion of it really looks like what archaeologists would call a McElmo face great house, so in the early 1100s thing that may have been expanded, possibly. There's a building here that might be a bi-wall structure, which again is it's a type of architecture that's common in Pueblo 3, seems to be related to political power and ritual. And then there's a wall. Actually, the whole site probably had an enclosing wall. There's a wall that runs straight up the slope here, which I think is really cool. This is looking down it, and you can see where the wall went over the boulders. There's still little remnants of rock on it, and the wall just runs straight down here. And then this is the thing that's maybe a bi-wall structure. This is that, again, potential bi-wall, which clearly has kiva-like architecture in the middle of it that's built above ground. So kivas are normally below ground, but in this case, it's probably sitting at least partially and maybe entirely above the ancient ground surface. This is a tower, the remnants of a tower that's up on top of the Meseta, near the top of that wall. So lots of things to say out here. I'll talk while I run this last. This is just to let you fly over that wall. And it didn't click wrong. Okay, here we go. So what I see here is we have this large village built around 1200 AD, built on the remnants of earlier settlement, but it incorporates all these really interesting architectural, unusual architectural things in an attempt. I think basically it's sort of, especially from this side that we're looking at in the flight, the entrance to the site is really funneled through that thing we call the shrine, and I think the architecture there is really built to impress visitors to the site, and it's an indication of I think something of the worldview and the I don't know quite how to say it, the power, the ability to sort of muster labor to build that kind of thing, and then and basically to show off this really impressive site. So that's what I have. To sum it all up, I think the one thing I would say that ties these three projects together is that what they show is that, first off, there's an awful lot of really cool archaeology in southeastern Utah. And it demonstrates that the ancestral Pueblo settlement of southeastern Utah was incredibly dynamic and changing through time, all sorts of different things going on, people moving, coming together, breaking apart. group identities shifting and moving, and there's a whole history there that we've really only just barely started to write. And that's it. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. That is some of the world's most fantastic archaeology, and we're lucky that you've been working there. Let me see what I've got. This question actually came in, I think, when you were talking about Little Bali Mesa, but you might answer it for all three sites. Is it clear that they are year-round residences?
I suppose that depends on how you define the word clear, but I would say yes, that there is good evidence. First off, the last two sites are gigantic with probably literally tons of trash on them. The sites on Little Bali Mesa that I'm calling habitation sites, there are sites out there where it's not clear that they're year-round residences, and I left those out. Right, there are a few sites that have structures on them, not much trash, but the ones I included have large trash deposits. They're relatively substantially built, and they look like year-round houses, as best as we can tell from surface indications.
I got a question. Has Coal Bed Village work been written up?
No, not quite yet. Things are in process, and there's a book that is sort of being worked on the archaeology of Montezuma Canyon. There will be a chapter in there. That will probably be the first thing that comes out.
I don't know if I should say who's putting in these questions, but here's one from our friend and colleague, Scott Ortman. It's interesting that the great house at Coal Bed faces west, but the shrine is on the east. What do the horizons to the east and west look like from that location? And does it give you any clues regarding what people were observing there?
It's a good question. Come visit us. I hope we'll be out there next year, and Scott can come look at it. It's down in the canyon, right? So the views are not very. The views are kind of restricted from there. You don't see for a long way. You do see the canyon rim. I've not climbed up there to anticipate what probably would be Scott's next question. I've not climbed to the canyon rim to see if there are shrines or anything up there, but there may well be.
Here's a question that's out of my league, and I'm not sure I understand it, but I'll ask it anyway. It says there are a Pishipa, which I believe is southeast Colorado area, like virginal slabs at this site, this last site. Why? So I suppose this person has seen archaeology in other regions that also have upright slabs. When you see something like that from different regions, do you think they're connected or do you think they're independent?
So where else are there slabs like that?
This says a Pishipa, which if I'm got it right, that's an archaeological area in southeast Colorado.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it, so I don't know.
All right.
I think actually it's a really good question, though, about how connected things are and whether and how extensive things like this use of megaliths like at Coal Bed are. There's lots of writing in archaeology about megalithic things in Europe and all of that, and we don't really talk about it in the Southwest. But since I've started talking about it and really talking about the wall there at Coal Bed, I've had a couple of people point out other things in the Southwest that have similar kinds of construction. I think that there's sort of a general tendency. It may be a human, I don't know if it's a universal, but at least a common thing that you do move big stones around, and for a couple of reasons. One is it looks cool, and secondly, it's sort of a statement of, hey, look what we can do. And a good way to mark just your presence, the presence of your social group on the landscape, and to demonstrate that you can get enough labor together to stand those rocks up.
So I got the comment and question. There's a lot of rock art in Montezuma Canyon. Did you include rock art in your study? And I'll further that one to ask, is there rock art at Coal Bed itself?
You know the answer to that, right? There's a little bit of rock art at Coal Bed. There are other studies that have done the rock, taken into account the rock art up and down the canyon. Here we're focused on excavating this one site. At Coal Bed, there's a little bit of rock art kind of toward the western thing, the last area I talked about, but it's not very prominent or interesting. But as you go north, basically from the view that we're looking at here, if you go north around the right side of the rock there, all the way up to the north end of the Meseta, there's a boulder that's covered on one face with what looks like probably ancestral Pueblo rock art. And then on the back side, there's some much less clear rock art. It's sort of repatinating and dark, where they've done what look like faces or masks in it's probably an archaic style. So there's some archaic style rock art on that boulder, which again is, it's 100 meters north of where we're looking in this photo. So
Right.
maybe it's closer to 200 meters.
Thanks. I'm going to do a couple more, and then we'll call it an evening. But this one is, you didn't talk about Tier 3 and its architecture. I think that means the stuff on the Mesa top. I'm not positive of that. Any comment about that?
Yeah, so there's a big building up on top, which looks, for most of it at least, doesn't seem quite as Great House-like. So there's three big buildings on the site, right? And we talked about two of them. The third one up on top seems less like a Great House because even though it's up on top of that Meseta, it doesn't quite have the same verticality. It's not as tall, basically. The rooms are not as tall. For the most part, there's one place where you actually do have kind of high level up, high level. But it looks, we haven't done excavation up there, and our work is focused on the lower tiers. But it's a big building. It seems to date to the same time period. It's got, I forget, 7 or 8 kivas in it. So it's, probably housed a good number of people. And there's also probably a good number of people on the slope to the left of what we're looking at in the, on the screen right now, sort of at the base of the cap rock. There's clearly buildings all along there for more than 100 meters. Probably.
Here's an interesting observation from our colleague Lynn Sebastian, which this thought passed through my mind. The upright slabs with a narrow paved passageway between there and the front wall of the house is a little reminiscent of the arcade at Chetro Kettle. So
yes,
I've thought about, go ahead.
I have said things about colonnades, and in fact, if I had a little more time to go more slowly, I might have brought it up here. It's true that colonnades are sort of a late Mesoamerican, post-classic Mesoamerican thing that get up into the southwest a little bit at Pacume and Chetro Kettle. One of the big questions, and one of the reasons we dug the trench across that wall and corridor, was I was really interested in the question of whether it was roofed, and therefore a real, legitimate colonnade or just a row of posts. I would say our excavations were just inconclusive. I don't know that it was or wasn't roofed, but I do think that I don't know how to demonstrate this for sure, but my feeling is that there may be some sort of symbolic vow to the powers to the south in building a sort of a colonnade like that. it's clearly not a Toltec colony or anything, or even as formal as the one at Chetla, where it's really nicely masonry. But I kind of think that's where that idea comes from. At least it's an idea that's out there, and you're seeing it expressed here in sort of a very distant, maybe not totally remembered or known form, but at least the idea of building a colony. I think
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to close with this last observation, and it's from someone who spent a lot of time in this part of the world, Virginia Woolf, and she says, if you climb up to the mesa top to the southwest of the shrine, there is a shrine-like feature looking back toward the village. So I'm not sure if you know that one, but
sounds like I haven't been up there. It sounds like we'll have to go look.
Yeah, right. That's what I thought. Well, thanks. I don't know. I'm sure I didn't get to every single question. They were coming in fast and furious. If we need to, we can go through them and I could try and answer them, or I'll send them to you, Jim, or Taylor will send them to you. And
right. Yeah, people can email me. I should say before everybody goes away, if you email me, I'm actually in the middle of moving, and so I probably will not see my computer tomorrow. I'm going to be moving furniture. So it may take me a couple of days to get back. But if you have questions, go ahead and email me, and I'll get to you, even if it takes a couple of days.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I also neglected to thank Edge of the Cedars. I think this was originally a Four Corners lecture series talk that was going to be there. Is that right, Jim?
That's right, yeah.
So we're, my favorite museum in the world, Edge of the Cedars, and they're great partners with us in this webinar series. So thank you, Edge of the Cedars. The accolades are pouring in, Jim. People loved your talk, and we're really grateful for you to taking time out of your busy schedule to present this webinar.
Thanks. I enjoyed it. I would rather have done it in person, but it was good. I hope people got something out of it.
I know I did. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon. And everybody, we had a couple hundred folks right up until the end. So everybody, we are really grateful for you tuning into this, and we hope to see you at our next webinar next Thursday. Thank you.